Extinguishment of Obligations, Part 1. Basically, when we speak of obligation, of course, it is a juridical necessity. The question is, how do you extinguish the juridical necessity that binds the debtor and creditor, or the obliger and the obligee? Okay? So, according to Article 1231, there are 10 modes of extinguishment of obligations. However, they are scattered all over the Civil Code. For enumeration purposes, I will enumerate it one by one. By payment or performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation or remission of the debt, by the confusion or merger of the rights of creditor and debtor, by compensation, by innovation, and other causes of extinguishment of obligations such as annulment, rescission, fulfillment of a resolutory condition, and prescription. 10 are mentioned in Article 1231. However, in addition, there is debt of a party in case of personal obligation, that is Article 1311, and mutual desistance or withdrawal, Article 1308, as explained in Saura Import and Export Company Incorporated versus Development Bank of the Philippines, 44 SCRA 445. Okay? Here, the borrower, after having been approved of the loan, instead of requesting that his loan be released, he wants the mortgage released. So, mas gusto niya yung mortgage release at wag na yung loan. So, in effect, Development Bank of the Philippines, as the creditor, acceded to the request of the borrower by releasing the mortgage. So, sabi ng Supreme Court, here is a classic example of mutual withdrawal that extinguish the obligation. So that is 1308. Okay? What else? Compromise. Article 2028. Number 4, impossibility of fulfillment. Article 1266. And happening of fortuitous event, 1174. Na-discuss na natin yung happening of fortuitous event. Death of a party is very self-explanatory. So we will focus on the 6 extinguishment of obligation, which are per payment or performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation or remission of the debt, by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor, by compensation, and by innovation. Payment or performance. The ordinary meaning of payment refers only to the delivery of money. Siyempre, sa mga common tao, it only means, or it simply means, delivery of money. But in legal parlance, or legally, it is a mode of extinguishment of obligation, where payment may also include giving of a thing, doing of an act, or not doing of an act. Okay? Because juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do, as defined in obligation. So, pag na-extinguish mo yon by giving of a thing, doing an act, or not doing an act, it is already considered payment. Because under the law, payment and performance are synonymous. Magkapareho sa batas, ang payment at performance ay synonymous. In fact, Meron pang isa, damages in lieu of the fulfillment of an obligation. As provided in my previous examples, kung halimbawa ang isang obligasyon ay merong damages na kalaki, halimbawa i-deliver mo sa akin ang kotse mo, deliver mo sa akin ang kotse mo, pag hindi mo deliver, magbabayad ka sa akin ng katumbas ng value ng kotse plus damages. Okay? So, yung value ng kotse plus damages are already in lieu of the performance of an obligation or payment to extinguish obligation. Okay? When is debt considered paid? Kailan ba? Okay? You have to look at the two aspects, the integrity of prestation and the identity of the prestation. Okay? When we speak of integrity of the prestation, a debt to deliver a thing, syempre including money, or to render service, is not understood to have been paid unless the thing or service have been completely delivered or rendered. Complete delivery and render of service. As the case may be, partial or irregular performance will not produce the extinguishment of an obligation. That is the general rule. Okay? Later, I will discuss ano ba yung mga exception to that general rule. Okay? So, ang sinasabi lang dito, dapat complete delivery and rendering of service as the case may be. Example, S obliged himself to deliver 100 sacks of rice to B. S delivered only 90 sacks. Under the law, there is no payment by S and B can refuse to pay for the 90 sacks if S does not deliver what is lacking. Okay, simple. Okay? Now, what else? Kunyari, X agreed to paint the house for Y for 100,000 pesos. X did not paint the kitchen anymore and instead asked Y to pay him 100,000 less the cost of painting the kitchen. Of course, this time Y can refuse to pay X because the debt of Y will arise only after the debt of X is completely rendered. Okay? So that is integrity of prestation. Now, when we speak of identity of the prestation, this second requisite means that the very prestation due must be delivered or performed. When the existence of a debt is admitted by the debtor or established by the evidence of the creditor, the burden of proving extinguishment by payment devolves upon the debtor who claims payment. Simply, ang sinasabi lang dito, class, is that if there is an existence of a debt which is admitted, tinanggap ng debtor at na-establish naman ng creditor yung evidence showing that there is an existence of a credit, at kung i-claim ng ating debtor na siya ay bayad na, ang gagawin lang ng creditor ay maghintay at ipakita ng debtor kung talagang siya ay bayad. It is burden upon the debtor to prove that he has already fulfilled or paid para ma-extinguish ang obligation. Okay? Okay. Again. Sinabi ko kanina, there are exceptions dun sa general rule natin that partial or irregular performance will not produce the extinguishment of obligation. That is the general rule. So what are the exceptions? What are the exceptions? First, Article 1234. Sabi dito, substantial performance in good faith. Is substantial performance in good faith an exception? The answer is yes, but there should be a requisite. Ano yung requisite na yon? Dapat substantial ang performance and in good faith. Because good faith is always presumed, tandaan nyo yung class, in the absence of proof to the contrary. Parating iniisip, ang batas natin, parating isipin, good faith ang tao. Pero pag nagpakita kahit katiting na parang hindi good faith, then it is not good faith. Example, si S obliged himself to deliver 500 bags of cement to B for a certain price. Okay? However, despite diligent efforts on his part, S was able to deliver only 400 bags because of cement shortage. Take note that S wants to comply with his obligation to deliver the entire 500 bags, but he could not do so because of reasons beyond his control. Okay? Under Article 1234, S can recover as though there had been complete delivery less the price of 100 bags. S must show, however, that he attempted in good faith to comply with his obligation. Okay? Hindi naman ibig sabihin, 500 pa rin cements ang babayaran. Ang sinasabi lang natin dito, as compared dun sa napag-usapan na hindi naman good faith, is that hindi kita babayaran hanggat di mo kumpleto ang pagpipintura ng bahay ko. Kasi iniwanan mo yung kitchen. This time, S wanted to deliver the whole 500 bags. However, there was a shortage of cement. So, hindi niya ma-deliver yung buo. So, he can claim payment only dun sa 400 cements. Okay? And that is compliance in good faith. Okay? Now, ano pa ang example natin? Ano pa ang ating tinatawag na exception? Okay? 1233, Article 1233 now is another exemption. Ito naman yung tinatawag nating the principle of estoppel. When we speak of principle of estoppel, this principle clearly states that it only prevents another person from claiming what he has already benefited from. Okay? Ulitin ko ha, ang person na to can no longer claim or he is prevented from claiming what he already received and benefited from. Okay? Example, si X agreed to paint the house of Y according to their stipulation. According to their agreement, X would use a particular brand of paint. If Y accepted the performance of X, knowing that the paint used was another brand, and without expressing any protest or objection, the obligation is deemed fully complied with. Okay? Kasi dito, class, tinanggap mo na nag-agree ka na. Kahit na hindi yun ang napag-usapan nyo. In fact, natapos na yung project without you contesting it, and not only hindi mo kino-contest, pero nag-enjoy ka na may benefit na on your part. So, you can no longer claim that there is irregularity or incompleteness of the delivery, thus making it valid for extinguishment of obligation. Or, you have waived your right to question the extinguishment of the obligation. What are the requisites? The obligee knows the performance is incomplete or irregular. Dapat alam ng obligee na yung performance is incomplete or irregular. And he accepts, number 2, he accepts the performance without expressing any protest or objection. Hindi naman siya umangal So, walang magagawa. No angal, sorry ka na lang. Okay? Next. Persons from whom the creditor must accept payment. Kanino ba? pwedeng tumanggap si creditor ng kanyang bayad. Of course, number 1 is debtor. Given naman yun. Kung sino may utang, siya magbayad. Pwede ba yung iba? Yes. Yung tinatawag nating guarantor, for example. Any person who has an interest in the obligation. Ang guarantor guarantees the debt and guarantees that the debtor will pay. So, pag hindi nagbayad ng debtor, siya ang sinisingil. So, ngayon, dapat may interest siya doon sa credit. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng any person who has an interest in the obligation. Meron pa ba? Yes. A third person who has no interest in the obligation when there is stipulation that he can make payments. Merong sinasabi ang batas na not only the debtor or the person who has interest in the obligation, but also a third person who has no interest in the obligation, provided as it was stipulated in the agreement that he can make a payment. Okay? He can make a payment. So, pwede yun. Okay? Ano? Can creditor refuse payment by third person? Yes. Pwede naman. Pwede naman, class. Actually, tinatanggap yun. Because it is a burden to a third person. However, if it is agreed upon, pumayag ka eh. So, I think the best answer to that is if it is truly stipulated and agreed upon by the parties, the creditor cannot refuse payment by third person. Okay? Pwede lang siya kung hindi naman to stipulated. Okay? That is my view in that situation. So, what are the effects? May effects ba ang pagbabayad ng third person? Oh, yes. Merong effects yan. Kasi kung hindi niya alam, first, if it is made without the knowledge or against the will of the debtor, the payer can recover from the debtor only insofar as the payment has been beneficial to the latter. Okay? Pwede. Anong effect? Una, pag hindi alam ng debtor na may nagbayad sa kanyang third person, pwede lang makarecover ang nagbayad up to the amount na binayaran niya lang. Yun ang diferensya. Class, if number 2, if it is made with the knowledge of the debtor. Pag alam ng debtor, anong effect? The payer shall have the rights of reimbursement and subrogation. That is to recover what he has paid and to acquire all rights of the creditor. Okay? Anong ibig sabihin ng subrogation and reimbursement? Subrogation is the person who pays for the debtor is put into the shoes of the creditor. So, yung nagbayad, nagiging creditor siya. Nagkakaroon siya ng karapatan to be the creditor. So, iba ang karapatan ng creditor kesa doon sa nagbayad ka lang na hindi alam ng debtor. So, pag binayaran ka, ito lang ang bayad ko sa'yo. Hindi gaya pag subrogation, the payer acquires not only the right to be reimbursed for he has paid, but also all other rights which the debtor could have exercised pertaining to the credit, either against the debtor or against third person. Okay? Pwede lahat. Ano yung mga yon? Pwede siya sa damages, pwede siya sa kung anumang penalty, kung anumang interest, pwede. Pwede siyang mag-charge. And that is subrogation. Against reimbursement, a reimbursement is only the third person entitled by reason of payment has merely the bare right to be refunded to the extent provided only na binigay niya. Okay? Without the rights of guarantee and securities of the original obligation. However, in subrogation, there is no real extinction of obligation, but only a change of creditor. Okay? Yung real story doon, hindi naman na-extinguish yung obligation. The obligation still exists. However, nagpalit lang ng creditor. Okay? So, in part, it is only extinguished doon sa unang creditor. But, in reality, nagpalit lang ng creditor. So, the obligation still exists. Okay? Next. Kanino naman dapat magbayad? Kanino naman dapat magbayad? Okay? Person to whom payment shall be made. Siyempre, kung sino naman ang inutangan, dun dapat magbayad. Hindi pa pwedeng kung kanino mo iaabot. Unless, okay, yung creditor mo, wala na. So, his successor in interest. Pwede kang magbayad doon. And those person who have or any person authorized to receive it. Okay? Any person who authorized to receive it. O sino ba mga authorized to receive? Okay? Sabi ng batas, ang mga authorized person to receive usually are guardians, executor, or administrator of the estate of the deceased and assignee, or liquidator of a partnership or corporation, as well as any other person who may be authorized to do so by law. Okay? Bigyan ko kayo ng example. Ito medyo ako interesting itong example na to because it involves Rural Bank of Santa Rita. Merong mga properties na nasanla sa Rural Bank of Santa Rita. However, nung nagsarado ang Rural Bank of Santa Rita, all the properties na sinanla ron ay napunta sa receivership or under the administration ng PDIC or Philippine Depositor Insurance Company. Tama ba ibig sabihin ng PDIC? Yes, PDIC. Okay? So, nasa PDIC. So, ngayon, yung mga taong interesadong tubusin ang kanilang property na nailit ng Rural Bank of Santa Rita, this time, dun sila magpupunta sa PDIC para tumanggap ng bayad nila at para makuha nila yung kanilang what you call this, yung kanilang property. So, yun ang ibig sabihin ng any person authorized by law to receive it. Pati yung guardian kasama dyan. Pag halimbawa, ikaw ay below 18 at hindi magulang mo ang guardian, the guardian can accept payment in behalf of the incapacitated person. Okay? So, anong ibig sabihin ng meaning of free disposal of a thing due or incapacity to alienate? Ito yung tinatawag natin pag sinabi mong free disposal of the thing means that the thing to be delivered must not be subject to any claim or lien or encumbrance of a third person. Halimbawa, dapat free disposal. Kung ang lupa nyo ay nakasanla, hindi siya free disposal kasi naka-mortgage siya. Ibig sabihin, yung bangko na pinagsanlaan nyo o yung taong pinagsanlaan nyo ay may claim, hindi free ang disposal. Hindi mo basta-basta ipamimigay yun or ibibenta kasi may mga taong involved or bangko na involved bago mo siya mailabas. Hindi free disposal. That is important. Because ang tinatanggap lang for payment are those free disposal of a thing. And, of course, you have the capacity to alienate. May capacity ka para ipamigay. May capacity ka para ibenta. Okay? Means that the person is not incapacitated to enter into contracts. And, for that matter, to make a disposition of the thing due. Okay? We will discuss incapacitated persons who are incapacitated to dispose or person who are incapacitated to enter into a contract pagdating natin sa contract. For an example, ang example lang naman dito na pinaka maiintindihan nyo of course is those person below 18 years old. Ulitin ko ha, below 18 years old. Hindi pwede yung, kasi ang 18 and above, pwede na yan mag-enter into a contract. But 18 and below, hindi pwede. Okay? Ano pa? Next. When is prestation may be substituted? Ano ba yung mga pwedeng ipalitan ang prestation? Substitution can be made if the obligee consents. Yun lang naman yun. If the obligee consents, like in facultative obligations, the debtor is given the right to render another prestation in substitution. Okay? So, pwede yun. Now, we move on to the special forms of payment. Meron kasi mga special forms of payment. Ito yung number 1, dasyon en pago or dasyon in payment, application of payments, payment by session, to tender of payment, and consignation. 4 yan. Pero technically or strictly speaking, application of payment is not a special form of payment. Ito yung kung paano mo i-apply, sino ba dapat ang unahin sa pagbabayad. However, it is part of special forms of payment. Now, dasyon en pago or dasyon in payment. It simply means that the conveyance of ownership of a thing as an accepted equivalent of performance. It is a special form of payment because it is not the ordinary way of extinguishing an obligation. An existing debt in money is satisfied but not by payment of money, but by alienation of property. Pinahihirapan ng batas. Sasabihin lang na wala kang pambayad, o di ang pambayad mo na lang yung kotse mo. Diba? Alienation of property. So, totoo lang, when we speak of dasyon in payment, it is governed by the law on sales. Kasi parang sales lang yan eh. Diba? Parang benta. Parang benta, pero it is called dasyon in payment as an extinguishment of obligation. So, parang benta siya. So, ang mag-govern na batas sa kanya is law on sales. Okay? Now, I'll give you an example. Si D owes C 30,000. To fulfill the obligation, ginawa ni D, with the consent of C, deliver niya yung piano. Okay? So, ganun lang kasimple ang dasyon en pago or dasyon en payment. Performance of obligation should be complete. Ano yung mga exception? May exception ba yan? May exception ba ang dasyon en pago? Of course, general rule, there is only one creditor and one debtor. In order that the payment may be extinguished an obligation, it is necessary that it must be complete performance of the prestation. The creditor may accept, but he cannot be compelled to accept partial performance. The debtor has the duty to comply with the whole of the obligation, but he cannot be required to make partial payments if he does not wish to do so. May exception? Meron. Ano yung exception? Again, express stipulation to that effect. Dapat pumapayag sila pareho. Number 2, when the debt is part liquidated and in part unliquidated. Number 3, when the different prestation in which the obligations consist are subject to different terms or conditions which affect some of them. Okay, example. D is indebted to C for 5,000 due today. D cannot compel C to receive 4,000 in partial payment of the obligation, and neither C can require D to pay only 4,000 unless, of course, there is express stipulation or there is an agreement. If, halimbawa na naman, if D owes 5,000, C 5,000 plus the share of C from the profit of a business which however has not yet been liquidated or determined, C may define, C may demand that, and D may effect the payment of 5,000 which is already known. Okay? If 4,000 of the debt of D is due today and 1,000 tomorrow, the obligation can be complied with partially. This is example number 3. If 4,000 of the debt of D is due today and 1,000 tomorrow, the obligation can be complied with partially. Similarly, partial performance may be effected in case the payment of 1,000 is subject to the fulfillment of a condition. Okay? So, that is dasyon and pago. O ano pa? But I have to discuss pala, legal tender. Para mas maintindihan nyo bago tayo magtuloy-tuloy. What do you mean by legal tender? Legal tender is the currency which a debtor can legally compel a creditor to accept in payment. Legally compel a debtor, a creditor to accept in payment of a debt in money when tendered by debtor in the right amount. Ano bang currency sa Pilipinas? What is the currency in the Philippines? The currency in the Philippines is Philippine pesos. Ay, Philippine pesos. Kailangan lagyan nyo ng Philippine pesos. Kasi alam ko sa ibang bansa may pesos din eh. Hindi ko lang alam kung anong bansa yun. But, there is. Okay? Ngayon, lahat ba pwedeng tanggapin? Pag nagbayad sa'yo, halimbawa may utang sa'yong 1,500. May utang sa'yo ang isang tao ng 1,500. Dapat ba tanggapin mo lahat? Okay? So the answer is, it depends. Sumagot kayo ng it depends. Okay? Now, tandaan nyo to class ha, please. For 1 peso to 5 peso denominations, ang pwede nyo lang tanggapin class is 1,000 and below. Pag lumagpas ng 1,000, pwede na kayo umangal. Pag binayaran kayo ng 5 pesos na worth 1.5 ay mali na yun. Okay? It should only be limited to 1,000 pesos. Eh, paano naman yung mga centavos, sir? Yung mga, gurami, yung mga barya-barya? Yung 1 cent, 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents. Hanggang ano lang yung limit nun? Ang limit lang nun, class, is 100 pesos. Kung may utang sa'yo ng 500 pesos, binayaran ka ng 25 centimos worth na 500 pesos, pwede mong isoli. Hoy, hindi ko tatanggapin to kasi ang legal tender ng Pilipinas pagdating sa coins ay 100 pesos lang, lalo na yung 25 centimos. Kung babayaran mo ko ng 5 piso, yan, pwede kong tanggapin hanggang 500. Okay? Nagkakaintindihan ba tayo? That is very important, class. Now, when we done na tayo sa legal tender. So, payment by means of instruments of credits. Meron pang ganon. Okay? Ang payment by instrument of credits, ito naman yung mga tinatawag nating mga negotiable instrument. Kaya ng promissory note, checks, bills of exchange, and other commercial document. Hindi sila legal tender. In strictly speaking, hindi siya legal tender unless it is already cash or converted to cash. Okay? Tandaan nyo yan, ha? Class, ang cheque pag binayaran ka, hindi pa na-extinguish ang obligation. It is just a means of instrument of credit payment. Pero pag binayaran ka, hindi ibig sabihin extinguish na. Ibig sabihin lang nun may proof na merong utang sa'yo at ito ay proof of instrument of credit. Now, pag ito ay na-encash mo na, that's the only time you can say that the obligation is extinguished. Okay? the obligation is extinguished. Noteworthy also of mentioning is inflation and deflation. Bakit? Kasi ito na yung paano ko nangutang sa'yo. At ang utang sa'yo ay nung time na yon mababa pa ang value ng pera. At nung nagbayaran na, iba na ang value ng pera. So kailangan mo nating alamin, ano ba ang inflation? At ano ba ang deflation? Inflation is a sharp, sudden increase of money or credit or both without a corresponding increase in business transactions. Inflation causes a drop in the value of money resulting in the rise of the general price level. Okay? Compared to deflation, ang deflation is the reduction in volume and circulation of the available money or credit, resulting in a decline of the general price level. It is the opposite of inflation. Ito yung opposite ng inflation. Okay? Now, the basis of payment in case of extraordinary inflation or deflation, paano ba ang mangyayari? Bibigyan ko ng example for you to easily understand. Okay? The purchasing value of the currency at the time of the establishment of the obligation shall be the basis of payment. Ulitin ko ha. The purchasing value of the currency at the time of the establishment of the obligation shall be the basis of payment in case of any extraordinary increase or decrease in the purchasing power of the currency, which the parties could not have reasonably foreseen. This is, however, subject to the agreement of the parties to the contrary. Example, si D borrowed from creditor 5,000 pesos payable after 5 years. On the maturity of the obligation, the value of 5,000 dropped to 2,500 because of the inflation, or increased to 10,000 because of the deflation. In this case, assuming there is extraordinary inflation or deflation, the basis of payment shall be the equivalent value of the currency today to that 5 years ago. Hence, D is liable to pay C 10,000 or 2,500, depende, unless there is an agreement to the contrary, that D shall pay 5,000 regardless of extraordinary decrease or increase in the purchasing power of the peso. Intindihan nyo, class? Are we clear on that? Okay? Now, saan ba nagbabayad? Place of payment. Okay, saan ba nagbabayad? Una, if there is a stipulation, the payment shall be made in the place designated. Kung ano na pag-agrihan, doon yun. Doon ang bayaran. If there is a stipulation, the thing to be delivered is specific, the payment shall be made at the place where the thing was at the perfection of the contract. Number 2. Number 3, if there is no stipulation and the thing to be delivered is generic, the place of payment shall be the domicile kung saan nakatira ang debtor. In this case, the creditor bears the expenses in going to the debtor's place to accept payment, subject to the rules. Okay? Tandaan nyo yan, ha? Una, if there's a stipulation, kung saan yung place designated. Again, kung merong stipulation, kung saan, okay, na-perfect ang kontrata. At number 3, kung wala namang stipulation, generic, the place of payment shall be the domicile or yung lugar ng debtor. Okay? What are next is, of course, number 2, in terms of special forms of payment is the application of payments. Okay? Ano ba yung application of payments na yan? Ano bang meaning niyan? Okay? When we speak of application of payments, it is the designation of the debt to which should be applied the payment made by a debtor who has various debts of the same kind in favor of one and the same creditor. Unang-una, requisites, para mas maintindihan nyo. Importante ang mga requisites class because without the requisites, mag-a-apply ba? Yun ang parating yung tanong eh. Requisites ng application of payments. Number 1, there should be one debtor and one creditor. Number 2, there are 2 or more debts. Number 3, the debts must be of the same kind. Number 4, the debts to which payment made by the debtor has been applied must be due. The payment made must not be sufficient to cover all debts. That is the number 5 requisite. Ulitin natin ha, for your understanding. Dapat isa lang ang debtor, isa lang ang creditor, at of course, dapat dalawa o mas marami pang utang. Dapat yung utang pareho, parehong kind. Okay? Number 4, the debt to which payment made by the debtor has been applied must be due. Dapat due lahat. Or kung saan niya in-apply, dapat due. And yung payment is not sufficient to cover all debts. Diba? Kasi nga maraming utang, dapat kung nagbayad siya ng buo, di walang problema. Kung kulang, saan mo i-apply yung utang? Saan mo i-apply? Okay? Application as to debts not yet due. The application of payments as to debts not yet due cannot be made. Hindi mo dapat gawin kung hindi pa due. That is the general rule. Except, merong stipulation na dapat i-apply o pwedeng i-apply doon sa hindi pa due. Or it is made by the debtor or creditor as the case may be for whose benefit the period has been constituted. Kasi merong mga utang class na merong period. Kaya lang yung period, kung it will benefit the debtor, then pwede nyong i-apply kahit na hindi pa siya due. Okay? Ano ba yung mga rules in application of payments? Okay? First rule, the debtor has the first choice. He must indicate at the time of making payment and not afterwards, which particular debt is being paid. Si debtor ang may first choice. Ano ba dapat ang unahing bayaran? That's the first rule. If it making use of his right, the debtor applied the payment to a debt, he cannot later claim then that it should be applied to another debt. Kung hindi naman din niya magagamit yung karapatan na yon, then he cannot later claim that it should be applied to another debt. Okay? Basta si debtor ang first choice. Yun ang tatandaan nyo. Okay? Kahit na siya yung may first choice, kailangan yung requisites ifa-follow. Number 2 rule, the right to make the applications once exercised, it is irrevocable. Unless, meron pa rin namang exception. Pag pumayag ang creditor. Okay? Pag pumayag ang creditor, hindi pwedeng paltan. Number 3, if the debtor does not apply payment, the creditor may make the designation by specifying in the receipts which debt is being paid. Kung ayaw mamili ng debtor, the creditor may do the choice. Okay? Siya yung pwedeng pumili. Pero dapat isulat niya sa resibo kung ano yung kanyang binayaran. Now, number 4, if the creditor has not also made the application or if the application is not valid, the debt which is most onerous to the debtor among those due shall be deemed to have been satisfied. Ang importante naman dito, yung onerous word. Kung walang napili yung debtor and creditor, ano ba ang pinakamabigat? Pinakamabigat in terms of interest, pinakamabigat in terms of, usually kasi interest class. Siyempre gusto mong mabayad kagad yung interest. Kung malaki yung interest, gusto mong mawala na yung utang mo. So doon ina-apply yun. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng onerous, yung mga pabigat. And number 5, if the debts due are of the same nature and burden, the payment shall be applied to all of them proportionately. So importante yun. Kung pare-pareho naman silang pabigat, pare-pareho ng interest, di ang gawin mo na lang, hatiin mo na lang proportionately. Okay? Now, this is interesting. Paano ang interest earned paid ahead of principal? Okay? If the debt produces interest, payment of the principal shall not be deemed to have been made until the interest have been covered. That is very clear under Article 1253. Hence, the debtor cannot choose to credit his payment to the principal before the interest is paid. The payment must be applied first to the interest. Tandaan nyo class ha, the payment must be applied first to the interest. And whatever balance is left can be credited to the principal. The creditor can refuse an application of the debtor made contrary to this provision. So, hindi pa pwede. So, unahin mo na yung interest bago yung principal. Okay? Anong ibig sabihin ng onerous? Nabanggit ko na rin yun. Okay? But, paano natin malalaman kung anong onerous? Diba, sinabi ko interest. Number 1, an interest-bearing debt is more onerous than a non-interesting debt, even if the latter is an older one. A debt as a sole debtor, number 2, is more onerous than as a solidary debtor. Okay, number 3, debts occurred by mortgage or by pledge are more onerous than an unsecured debt. Yung nasa mortgage. Siyempre kasi may nakasanla, may kapalit. So, hindi pa pwede. Of 2 interest-bearing debts, the one with a higher debt is more onerous. Given naman yon, as I have mentioned. Number 5, an obligation with a penalty clause is more burdensome the one without a penalty clause. Siyempre, kung yung may penalty clause, mas burdensome yon. Okay? Next. Payment by session. Ano naman ang ibig sabihin ng payment by session? Payment by session is another special form of payment. It is the assignment or abandonment of all the properties of the debtor for the benefit of his creditors, in order that the latter may sell the same and apply the proceeds thereof in satisfaction of their credits. Ulitin ko ha. Payment by session is another special form of payment. It is the assignment or abandonment of all the properties of the debtor. Inabandon niya lahat ng kanyang property for the benefit of his creditors, in order that the latter may sell the same and apply proceeds thereof to the satisfaction of their credits. Binigyan kita ng property, ibenta mo. At yung proceeds, ikaw na bala mag-apply kung saan mo siya ibabayad. Anong requisites? Importante again ang requisites. There must be 2 or more creditors this time. 2 or more creditors. The debtor must be insolvent or partially insolvent. The assignment must be involve all the properties of the debtor, and the cession must be accepted by the creditors. Importante yung lahat. Una, there must be 2 or more creditors. The debtors must be partially insolvent or insolvent. The assignment must involve all the properties. Hindi pa pwedeng patingin-tingin. Dapat all the properties. And the cession must be accepted by the creditors. What will be the effect? Unless there is a stipulation to the contrary, the assignment does not make the creditors the owners of the property of the debtor. The debtor is released from the obligation only up to the net proceeds of the sale of the property. In other words, the debtor is still liable if there is a balance. Anong effect nun? Provided lahat ng requisites ay present. So, pwede kang mag-payment by session. Ang utang mo sa creditors mo ay 100,000. Ang property mo, ang nabenta lang 70,000. In effect, may utang ka pa rin na 30,000. So, that is payment by session. Hindi lahat nabayaran mo. So, ang nabayaran mo lang, yung net proceeds ng iyong property. Okay? So, anong kaibahan naman nun, sir? Sa dasyon in payment and session. In dasyon, there is only one creditor, while in session, there are several creditors. Di ba? Yun yung number 1 na napansin natin. Sa dasyon, isa lang ang creditor. Number 2, differences. Dasyon does not presuppose a solvency of the debtor. Sabi ko sa inyo, importante yung insolvent. Kasi sa dasyon, wala namang sinasabing insolvency. Basta ibigay mo yung property mo kapalit, yun na yun. Dito kailangan insolvent pa yung debtor bago pumasok ang payment by cession. Because the debtor in payment by cession should be insolvent at the time of the assignment. Ano pa? Dasyon does not involve all the property of the debtor, while cession extends to all the property of the debtor subject to execution. Sa dasyon, kung ano lang yung pwedeng mo ibigay, yun ang ibigay mo. Pero sa cession, dapat all the properties. Kaya nga po siya dapat insolvent. Hindi mo pwedeng ibenta or ipamigay ang property mo kung hindi ka insolvent. Okay? Insolvent is declared by law or by the courts. In dasyon, the creditor becomes the owner of the thing given by the debtor, while in cession, the creditors only acquire the rights to sell and apply the proceeds to their credits proportionately. Gaya nga na sinasabi natin in dasyon, parang sales yan. So, kung sales yan, napunta sa iyo yung pag-aari ng property na binayad ng debtor. As compared to cession, hindi. Okay? May karapatan ka lang sa proceeds. Proceeds ng napagbentahan ng property. Okay? Dasyon is really an act of novation. I will explain novation pagdating natin sa, of course, sa other mode of extinguishment ng obligation, while cession is not an act of novation. Okay? So, para ma-explain ko, dasyon is really an act of novation. Okay? Because there is a change of prestation. Okay? Na-extinguish yung unang prestation, napalitan ng bago. So, it is considered novation. Okay? Next. Tender of payment and consignation. This is the last topic for payment. Okay? So, ano ba naman ang ibig sabihin ng ating tender of payment and consignation? First, we look at the 1256 of the Civil Code. Article 1256. By definition, sabi ng Article 1256, if the creditor to whom tender of payment has been refused without just cause to accept it, the debtor shall be released from responsibility by consignation of the thing or sum due. Consignation alone shall produce the same effects of the following cases: when the creditor is absent or unknown and does not appear at the place of payment, when he is incapacitated to receive the payment at the time it is due, when without just cause he refuses to give a receipt, and when two or more persons claim to the same right to collect, and when the title of the obligation has been lost. Okay? Ibig sabihin nito, dito pumapasok ang consignation. Ano ba ibig sabihin muna ng tender of payment? Binasa ko yung batas, but I have to tell you, ano ba ibig sabihin ng tender of payment? When we speak of tender of payment, it is the act on the part of the debtor of offering to the creditor the thing or amount due. The debtor must show that he has in his possession the thing or money to be delivered at the time of the offer. So, tender of payment, nag-o-offer ka sa creditor kung magkano, ito ino-offer ko sa'yo. Ito ang bayad ko. Ganun lang kasimple ang tender of payment. How about consignation? Itong consignation is the act of depositing the thing or the amount due with the proper court when the creditor does not desire or cannot receive it. After complying with the formalities required by law, consignation is applicable when there is debt or an obligation to pay. It is always judicial and generally requires a prior tender payment which is by its nature extrajudicial. Explain ko maigi. Tender of payment, ito yung act na nag-o-offer ka sa iyong creditor. Kung hindi tatanggapin ng iyong creditor, consignation is the next step. Ano yung gagawin sa consignation? Pupunta ka sa korte at dun mo ilalagay yung pera na pambayad mo dapat sa creditor. Bakit? Kasi either ayaw tanggapin or incapacitated ang iyong creditor to accept the payment. Eh ikaw, nagmamagandang loob ka, binayad mo, ayaw tanggapin, o hindi pumunta ka sa korte, o binabayad ko po, iiwan ko po ito, kasi ayaw pong tanggapin. Okay? What are the requisites for a valid consignation? Okay, of course, unang-una, dapat there is a valid debt which is due. Dapat may utang na, at yung utang ay due na. Dapat, pangalawa, there is a tender of payment by the debtor and refusal without justifiable cause by the creditor to accept it. Ayaw tanggapin, pero nag-tender of payment ka. Ganon ka-importante ang tender of payment. There is a previous notice of consignation to persons interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. Dapat magno-notice ka rin. So una, may valid debt and it is due. Nagbigay ka, nag-tender of payment ka, pero ayaw tanggapin. O hindi magno-notice ka. Kung hindi mo tinanggap to, i-consign ko na to sa korte. Then, consignation of the thing or sum due sa korte. And then, subsequent notice of consignation made to the interested parties. At sinasabi mo na, pag nailagay mo na sa korte yung pera, gagawa ko ulit ng notice at sasabihin mong, oh, ayaw niyong tanggapin, naadala ko na sa korte. At sa korte niyo na kunin. Sa korte niyo na kunin ang inyong pera. Okay? Now, meron bang instance, is there an instance that tender of payment is not required? Kasi sinasabi natin doon sa mga requisites, dapat mag-tender of payment ka, di ba? Now, merong sinasabi sa kaso ni Kapisanan Banahaw versus De Jarme and Alvero, 55 Philippines, 339. Philippine Report, 55 Philippine Reports, 339. It has been held that a creditor who, without legal justification, informs his debtor that payment of a debt will not be accepted thereby, waives payment on the date when the payment will be due, and as a consequence, the debtor in such case excused from making a formal tender of money on such date. The debtor does not incur default by failing to make fruitless tender after notification from the creditor that the money will not be received. Kasi nagkusa na yung creditor na hindi ko tatanggapin yung pera. So, pointless na yung tender of payment. So, requisite number 4 of tender of payment can be waived already because of the action of the creditor by saying, hindi ko na tatanggapin yan. So, that is the case of Kapisanan Banahaw versus De Jarme and Alvero, 55 Philippine Reports, 339. Okay? Now, what are the requirements for a valid tender of payment? May requirements din ang ating valid tender of payment. Of course, number 1, tender of payment must comply with the rules on payment. The tender, even if valid, does not itself produce legal payment unless completed by consignation. Tandaan nyo yan, ha? Must comply with the rules of payment. Hindi porket nagbayad ka na, nagbigay ka na, extinguish ng obligation mo. Kailangan matatawag natin ito na legal payment kung naibigay mo na sa korte, kung na-consign mo na, or there is already a completed consignation. Number 2, it must be unconditional and for the whole amount. Hindi pa pwedeng partial or irregular. Kailangan complete and unconditional for the whole amount. Number 3, it must be actually made. The manifestation of a desire or intention to pay is enough. Okay, sinabi mo ng bayad. Kung hindi sinasabi mo bayad, hindi naman pala totoo. Hindi naman siya valid tender of payment. Okay? Yung notice are all self-explanatory. Okay? Kailangan may notice doon sa mga person interested. Diba? 2 notice yun. Sabi mo na, i-consign mo na at na-consign mo na. Okay? It should be with the proper judicial authority. Hindi kung sino-sinong korte lang. Dapat it is consignation is by depositing the thing and some due with the proper judicial authority. Okay? To effect yung payment. Kasi sabi ko nga kanina, isa sa mga requisites ng valid tender of payment, dapat doon sa korte na ikaw ay para ma-produce mo yung completed consignation. Para ma-consider na talagang ma-extinguish yung iyong obligation. Okay? Important aspect is the creditor bears the expenses of consignation. Alalahanin niyo sa Pilipinas lahat may gastos. So pag dineposito ang pera mo doon, hindi na kasalanan ng debtor yun kasi yung debtor willing to pay. So it is the creditor who is not willing to pay. Now, any questions so far? Okay? Alalahanin natin, class, that this is just one of the modes of extinguishment of obligation. Part 2 will be the other modes of extinguishment of obligation. So watch out for part 2 on modes of extinguishment of obligation.